last night.
I enjoyed having you.
cheaped up on us.
Good morning, everyone.
Morning.
Welcome to the second day of the workshop, which should be closed out pretty quickly, and then we'll move into our action meeting. Before I do, I just really want to thank Mr. Miller for he and his wife Gigi's hospitality last night. What a beautiful home. It was just a lovely evening, and thank you so much for opening your home in such a beautiful setting to all of us.
Home is always open to y'all. Thank you for coming.
Safety. How long have you and Gigi been married?
It would be 35 years.
Miracle as well.
Yeah. We dated for 7, so we claimed 42 of.
And for those of you who are here who may not know Gigi, she is lovely. So,
I can understand why they dated for
Contrast.
7 years, though.
She's a saint, right?
Contrast is remarkable, is it not? Saint Gigi.
it was really fantastic. So thank you very, very much. With that, Mr. Donahue, I think we'll just get a very quick legislative update.
Madam Chair, members of the board, I'm here this morning to talk briefly about a legislative update, and then I also want to talk about one of the homework assignments that was given to us by the General Assembly for you all to work on in the interim. As we've talked in the past, many of the bills that we discussed with you all at the January board meeting have gone by the wayside. The General Assembly, has left town. They sent, I believe, 800 some bills to the governor's desk. Many of the ones that caused concern for this board did not pass the General Assembly, which is good news there. Unfortunately, the I-81 bill that passed the General Assembly did not provide any dedicated funding source. There was some movement afoot at the end of the General Assembly, which is why at the February meeting I was not with you very often to try and figure out whether there was a path forward that could get some consensus to generate revenues for 81 and also potentially address some other interstate corridors in the Commonwealth at the same time. I think there was bipartisan support for the concept. Ultimately, I think a short clock hurt that effort, and it was not able to advance at the final hour there. There is a bill, though, two bills, before the governor for his consideration. And just as a quick reminder, for those of you who don't deal with the legislature as often as others, the governor has the right to amend, veto, or sign any bill that was not a 7-day bill that has been sent to him, and he has until next Tuesday, March 26th, to communicate any decision he has made on pending legislation to the General Assembly. The Assembly is going to reconvene on April 3rd, the following week, to consider any amendments, vetoes, or other things that he has sent down. If the governor amends a bill and it goes before the General Assembly and the General Assembly fails to adopt those amendments, but fails to adopt them with a positive vote of less than 2/3, then the governor still has the right to determine whether to sign or effectively veto that bill after session. And so amendments at the veto session are a little different than kind of amendments, on the floor at other times, because you have to get to that veto-proof kind of rejection of an amendment to take away the governor's discretion after veto session. So again, the I-81 bill is before the governor for his consideration. What the bill does in its current form is it recognizes the I-81 corridor plan that you all adopted in December. It establishes an I-81 corridor improvement plan. It does not deposit any money in that fund at the moment. It also establishes an I-81 committee of this board that would consist of 4 delegates, 3 members of the Senate, the 5 planning district commission chairs, and the 3 CTB members from the 81 corridor. It also charges this committee to meet between the end of this session and the beginning of the next session and say, okay, we could not reach a consensus in the 2019 session. This committee, which is going to have state and local as well as board representation, needs to meet in the interim and keep discussing how should we fund this. I believe there's a requirement actually to hold 4 meetings a year, and it does require that committee to provide a report back to the General Assembly, I believe in December of 2019, saying how they would recommend capitalizing the fund. And it also says, take a look at the projects should your recommendations on funding levels be insufficient to fund the full $2.2 billion package of improvements. So again, I think we are disappointed that we weren't able to get revenue in that bill. to the governor's desk. The governor has until next Tuesday to review that legislation, and again, that will be communicated on the 26th, and I'm sure we will be in communication with you all once we know what the governor's decision on that legislation is. Any questions on that before we move on?
Madam, in general, because you're on the subject, but I recently read that the president's proposed budget cuts transportation. I don't think he's submitted it to the Congress yet. Have y'all seen any of that and see where the cuts may be if they indeed are? I don't pay much of attention to the news in terms of believing everything I see or read, but have y'all looked at it?
Madam Chair, Mr. Williams, the way the budgeting process works at the federal level is different than how it works at the state level. So again, when the governor in Virginia submits the Appropriations Act, that is actually the bill that is before the Assembly. At the federal level, when the president releases through the Office of Management and Budget his quote-unquote budget proposal for a year, it's kind of a top-level policy document that is very pretty and shiny, and it goes on the White House website, and there's a press release and a press conference typically. It is not the legislation that starts before either the House or the Senate.
What you're saying is you haven't read it.
Sorry, sir?
So what you're saying is you haven't read it.
I have read it, sir. It does fully fund very close to being successful in I-81 and Hampton Roads Bridge Tunnel last year, but ultimately weren't. So they proposed to increase that from $1 to $2 billion. It does propose cuts to the Transit New Starts grant program. That is something that we've used for Dulles Rail, that was used for Norfolk Light Rail, that could potentially be used for a Long Bridge project in the future and other things of that nature. So it's kind of a interesting thing. I think it also made some changes to Amtrak, where it essentially puts in place a policy construct that the national network, which is the long distance trains over a certain length, would transition to something else. And that something else would not involve support from the federal government. So I think a lot of people are concerned as to, are we transitioning into nothing, or are we transitioning into something else? And if that's something else, who is paying for that and this new transitioned concept? Again, Congress will have its full discretion to consider these things, and ultimately there's the Budget Committee that sets high-level caps. There's then the appropriators who determine all the specifics, and it will be, I think, interesting to see what ultimately happens.
You read the bill.
Yes. I'm pretty proud of him.
Tell us what's on page 21.
Not transportation.
Mr. Donahue, before you proceed,
Madam Secretary, I was going to ask a question.
Yes, Mr. Dodson.
What about the handheld legislation as far as phones? I think it got close but didn't get across the finish line that we supported.
Madam Chair, so there are two bills, or there were two bills dealing with handheld phones and whether those were things that could be used while driving in Virginia. One was enacted. It was a much more limited construct about work zones and whether handheld devices could be used in work zones. That more limited construct did make it to the governor's desk there, and again, the governor has until next week to review that. I don't believe he's acted on that legislation. There was a second, much more broad piece of legislation that dealt with the use of handheld phones generally on the highways in the Commonwealth. The bill passed both the House and the Senate. It obviously had some differences, and so it went to a conference committee, and the bill remains there today. It never came out of conference for a final consideration, is my understanding, on the last day of the Assembly.
Thanks.
Mr. Donahue, I was going to say is that, getting that base bill out was still very important to this process. So, in having the committee in place, a fund established, the plan supported and approved, actually gives us a lot to work with in the coming year and keeps 81 a priority moving forward as we look at the sustainability of funding for transportation, which this board has been discussing for certainly for the past year and even longer, recognizing the limitations of the gas tax.
And Madam Chair, if I could correct the record, I misspoke. It came out of conference, the broader bill, and failed on the House floor. So ultimately, the differences that were reconciled were not in conference, were not reconciled in a manner that was acceptable to a majority of the members of the House.
And the handheld.
Handheld bill, yes. And one other item before I get to this, if I could, the last session, there was Senate Bill 971 that directed this board to develop the I-81 corridor improvement plan. While the General Assembly failed to provide funding for that, many members have been complimentary of the work that this board did. In fact, they were so complimentary, they've decided you should do it again. And this time you should do it for the I-95 corridor. I would stress that what was passed in 2018 was a bill. A bill has the force of law, and it directed you specifically to undertake the I-81 corridor improvement plan with certain parameters. What passed this year was a House joint resolution and a Senate joint resolution directing the board to develop an I-95 corridor improvement plan looking only from mile marker 118 to, I believe, the Springfield interchange. That is in a request, which the Secretary has said this is something she is interested in honoring, but I think we also have broader flexibility in interpreting what you all believe is the appropriate scope and size of that study. I think there are many people who believe 95 might have some issues north of the Springfield interchange and south of mile marker 118. The House bill did include some provisions related to also considering whether transit could help address some of those problems, while the Senate bill was silent on that matter. Again, ultimately, as it is a request, there is executive discretion in how that is implemented. And again, I am just stressing that it's a request. That doesn't mean we're not going to advance it, but it is different than a bill. The governor has the opportunity to review, amend, or veto bills. He does not have that opportunity with a joint resolution, which is why the joint resolution does not have the force of law.
I'm going to ask a question of Amy White. How many studies came out of the General Assembly this year? So. There you go. You all did such a great job on 81. All right, with that, Mr. Donahue. Oh, Mr. Whitworth.
As I understand it, then, something still could happen on April the 3rd, when General Assembly reconvenes.
Madam Chair, Mr. Whitworth, the governor has until next Tuesday to determine whether he wishes to sign, veto, or amend that legislation. If he signs the legislation, there will be no discussion on the 3rd. That will just become the force of law on July 1, and then you will have 4 meetings between now and December to discuss how to try and fund 81. If he chooses to veto the legislation, that will go before the Assembly, and they will have the opportunity to try to override that. If he recommends amendments to the bill, those will go down for an up or down vote on the floor of the House and the floor of the Senate. If it succeeds in either chamber, it will then go to the next. And if it succeeds there, then those amendments and the base bill will become law.
Do you have any viable scenarios of what amendments there may be?
Madam Chair, Mr. Whitworth, I would never try and predetermine the actions of the chief executive.
Understand.
Is a very good deputy secretary.
There are a few things you should make guesses about, and I've learned that's probably a good one. So one of the other main charges that came out of this session, and this was included in the Appropriations Act, was really asking this body and the Secretary and the Department to take a look at the sustainability of Virginia's transportation funding. There was a bill that came out of the Senate, and there was budget language in the House. Ultimately, the budget language is what was passed by the Assembly and is, again, now before the governor in the Appropriations Act. And what that language states is it's the intent of the General Assembly that we take a look at the impact of increased fuel efficiency and increased use of hybrid and electric vehicles on our transportation revenues and identify potential options to provide a sustainable funding stream for transportation infrastructure in the Commonwealth. We've had a long discussion with the General Assembly for years about hybrid vehicles, CAFE standards, and electric vehicles are really going to, at some point, start to impact our fuels tax revenue. I think for a long time, the Assembly viewed that as, we believe you. Sometime in the future, that will happen, and when that happens, we'll start to have that conversation. Something the Secretary presented, though, to both the money committees and the transportation committees in the Assembly, I think got their attention this year, which is for the first time ever, in my knowledge, in Virginia, driving has increased and our actual fuels tax collections have gone down. This is not we missed a projection, we thought we were going to grow at 5% and we only grow at 2.5% and we wish we would have grown more. Driving went up 3.2% and our actual collections over 2 fiscal years went down 0.6%. That, in my opinion, is an inflection point. I'm nervous this trend will continue. We don't see why this would break the other way in reverse. We know many of the large auto manufacturers are shifting to either all-electric or all-electric and hybrid vehicles moving forward. But even with addition to that, the CAFE standards, each model year when these cars are coming out, they're more and more fuel efficient. The fuels tax revenue is about $850 million of our state transportation revenue, so it's our third largest revenue stream. But if we lost it, just to kind of put that in perspective, there's no smart scale, there's no state of good repair, there's effectively no transit program, and I think we're short on maintenance. And so while it is, 800 out of 3.4 billion, it's $800 million when you just kind of whack that out of the system, takes away many of the things that build the enhancements that the folks in your communities like to see from our transportation system. If we had actually had our fuels tax collections keep up with driving, there'd be $60 million more in the bank just this current fiscal year. I know $60 million doesn't sound like the largest sum, but again, you program money in 6-year increments. That's, if I'm doing my math right, and I did math wrong yesterday, so I'm just going to put that caveat out there. That's more than $350 million. I was being close. Just give myself a little room there.
I did remind you of that this morning.
Yeah. You did that math wrong yesterday. I did.
I said, wait, let's go back and check something one more time. I go, you did make a mistake yesterday.
And so again, and if driving would keep going up and if fuels kept going up, it would likely be in excess of $360 million. And again, that's a lot of extra money in smart scale. Yesterday we talked about redistributing $107 million, which is going to make a big difference in many of the districts. Imagine if we were talking about redistributing $360 or $400 million over this 6-year window. It dramatically changes how far these dollars can go and which communities are seeing these improvements. And so it's these small little hits that are happening, but they really add up over time. And again, if this trend continues, more and more use in the system and less revenues coming in, that's not a sustainable kind of way moving forward. And the Assembly members really paid attention to the Secretary's presentation. This was brought up by many members in public and private discussions. And so that's why I think you've seen them ask us to take a look at this issue between now and next session and hopefully identify some opportunities to address this situation. As we start this process, I think it's important that we kind of start with a baseline, like how do we fund transportation in Virginia? Is it similar to other states? Is it different than other states? And where are we actually getting our money? And so here are state revenue sources for the Commonwealth Transportation Fund. That's what CTF stands for. So again, that is highways, transit, rail, ports, aviation. It's our transportation system writ large. As you can see, the gas and diesel tax together are about $850 million. Our registration fees are around $300 million. In most states, those are their base kind of funding sources for the transportation system. In Virginia, they're actually our third and fourth largest sources. We also have a motor vehicle sales and use tax, which a lot of other states have, but not all states do. And in some states, that money goes to the general fund because it's just a sales tax. It's not a special sales tax. In Virginia, we have a 5.3% retail sales tax, and that's distributed to that form. And then we have a separate 4.15% motor vehicle sales tax. So there is some dissonance between rates there, and all of that comes to transportation. And that's $940 million a year. So this is our second largest revenue stream. It's an extremely important one there. Our single largest revenue stream, though, since the 2013 transportation bill, is general retail sales and use tax. It provides over $1 billion of our $3.4 billion for our transportation program. And we started this trend in 1986, and it was increased significantly in the 2013 bill. And so we had a 0.5% of the sales tax rate in 86, and they put another 0.4 into transportation in 2013, and that's why that's our single largest transportation funding source. We also receive insurance premiums and then a whole host of very, very small fees that when added up together are around $100 million. That's vehicle rental taxes, a few pennies on real estate transfers, and other things of that nature.
Secretary. Retail, and this presentation does not reflect the additional taxes that are collected in the regions?
Madam Chair, Mr. Miller, that's a very good point.
which
These
all
are
goes to-
pure statewide revenues that come to this board and other state transportation agencies. This does not include the incremental retail sales in Northern Virginia Hampton Roads or the incremental fuels tax in Northern Virginia Fredericksburg or Hampton Roads.
Those are significant dollars in terms of how they impact, obviously, the Commonwealth.
Correct. I believe, as you noted yesterday, about 80% of the $3+ billion Hampton Roads Bridge Tunnel project is being financed regionally.
Madam Secretary, again, I'm asking your opinion, and I know you'll be cautious about that, but the 81 solution, is there a possibility that conversation could expand to deal with our long-term transportation funding for the Commonwealth?
Madam Chair, Mr. Malvin, I would say a lot of that depends on what happens in April, if anything, and if things don't happen in April and this body and the Secretary are charged to look at this issue between now and next Assembly, I think there are still many folks who are going to want to see Interstate 81 fixed, even if we aren't successful this year, and these discussions very well could have one and the same next session.
My question is, could the solution be embedded in a bigger solution for our transportation needs?
General Assembly has a long history of enacting complex, multifaceted transportation bills, and those tend to be the ones that are often successful.
Good answer.
Thank you, Mr. Donahue.
Yes,
Good political.
Better now?
possible.
So just those are our revenue streams, but I think what's really important is these revenue streams, well, the other thing is just on the retail sales and use tax, we're unique. That is not something that very many states do. In most other states, they really use revenues directly related to use of the system for their funding. In Virginia, we're one of 5 other states that use the retail sales and use tax, and I think we are probably one of the most reliant states with regard to revenues on this retail sales and use tax, and that again makes us pretty unique in this world. It also impacts kind of who's paying for our system and whether we're getting equitable or inequitable shares from in-state or out-of-state peoples or different types of users of the transportation system. The other thing that I think is
Back a second. Let me just, Madam Secretary, I just want to make sure I'm clear, because I think what you're saying, like for Kansas, it's 1 percentage point out of the 6.5%.
That's correct. Yes.
Not 1% of.
That is correct.
6.5%.
They have a sales tax rate there of 6.5%, and 1%
point.
of that 1 point.
1 point, not percent.
Correct.
Gotcha.
Luckily for this board, we have the sales taxes and transportation because our revenue streams are not growing at the same rate over time. So what this slide shows you is that from 2011 through the end of the 6-year program window, our retail sales and use taxes are the ones growing, at a clip that is in line with inflation, while our fuels taxes are projected to, from that time period, again, that's going back to 2011, to grow at 0.7% a year, so significantly below inflation, and our registration fees are going at the exact same amount. Now, when you see these numbers, like, what's the difference between 2.9% or 0.7%? It's kind of hard to, understand what that means, so I wanted to run some figures for you all. If our fuels tax and registration fees had grown starting in 2011 at the same rate as the retail sales and use tax, the 6-year program you're considering this June would have an additional $1.9 billion in there. And so if you think about that, due to the declining value in collections and increased fuel efficiency and the fact that our registration fees have not been adjusted over time to keep up with inflation or other things of that nature, we've effectively lost, in just this 6-year program upcoming, almost $2 billion of resources. That would dramatically change, again, I think, what people see in transportation happening across the Commonwealth, and just so you can really kind of understand what those impacts would be, here's how those funds would be distributed. There'd be another $790 million in the State of Good Repair program. Just to go back to yesterday in a resolution that you'll see later today in the action meeting, if we had another $790 million in the State of Good Repair program, we wouldn't have had to get legislation passed and come to you to ask you to waive the cap in the State of Good Repair program to fix the southern trestles. We would have just funded and fixed the southern trestles. There could be another more than $900 million in the State of Good Repair program. Again, we're missing effectively an entire round and then some of smart scale because our revenues are not growing at the rates with inflation. There'd be additional money for transit as well, and there'd be additional money for the Priority Transportation Fund, which helps us sell debt and also support key things like the Atlantic Gateway. So again, it's small little increments. It's whether you're growing at 2% versus 0.7%, and it doesn't sound like much, but over time, the cumulative effects of this is very, very meaningful on our transportation system. And again, I'm really heartened that the Assembly has asked us to take a look at this issue kind of in the intervening time here and come back to them next session to discuss this issue. One of the other things that I think is unique in Virginia with regard to our transportation system is because of our high reliance on retail sales and use tax, we also, it's interesting as to who's paying for our system. Again, in most other states, the way that they fund the system is fuels tax registration fees, and some other states, motor vehicle sales tax or the titling tax. Because our single largest revenue stream is retail sales tax, which is almost exclusively paid by residents of Virginia and drivers of cars, what we have in Virginia, and this is your combined state and federal sources that you see here, so some of the numbers are a little bit bigger if you're wondering why. Autos and residents pay almost 84% of each and every transportation dollar that's available in Virginia, while trucks, which are large users of the system, very heavy, take up more space than cars and create more damage, only pay a little bit more than 13% of our transportation program in Virginia. And again, that is directly related to our large reliance on the retail sales and use tax. But what this does is it means that in Virginia, residents are paying a significantly larger share of transportation revenue than the trucking industry is, particularly compared to other states nearby. And so here's some examples that we discussed during session. And again, I'm bringing this up because it was talked about in the context of I-81. So again, you're seeing the other states in which I-81 runs. And I should note before I go through these numbers, the figures you see there about the percentage of state and federal transportation dollars paid by trucks in other states, those figures were pulled directly from materials put together by a research subsidiary of the American Trucking Association. We do not have full insight into how those figures were created. Based on some discussions we've had with some folks, those figures may not take into account the titling tax in some other states. And so if you did that, these percentages in other states might drop by 5 or 10%. So instead of it being 39% in Pennsylvania, it might only be 30% or 34%. What I would say, though, is as you look at this chart, whether or not those figures go down 5 or 10% to take into account the titling tax, they're still significantly higher than 16%.
Nick, if we were to apply that average of the 81 corridor to Virginia, do you know what the economic impact would be, what the additional revenues collected would amount to?
I need to go back to the next slide, or the previous slide, excuse me. So overall, we have $4.5 billion. So each 10% is $450 million. Each percent is 45. So using 50, so I don't screw up the math.
$600 million.
You know, 5% is $300 million. Mm-hmm. And again, as you add more money, the percentage actually becomes, each point is worth more and more. But overall, if you were to rejigger that to get closer, you'd have to shift $300 or $500 million from the auto resident side over to the trucking side to get percentages that would be more akin or similar to the other states along the 81 corridor.
Secretary.
Yeah.
Nick, how are the other states capturing that revenue? What is it the diesel, fuel? What are they doing to capture it?
That's a really good question.
Madam Chair, Mr. Brown, it's a mix of two things.
No,
it is
because
higher.
Excuse me. We're having a side conversation.
Okay.
I apologize.
It's higher diesel taxes and in some cases higher registration fees. But almost every, actually not almost, every single state on the 81 corridor has a significantly higher diesel tax rate than we do in the Commonwealth. Tennessee is the closest to us, and I think they're 4 cents higher. Pennsylvania, and I want to stress before I get into, I am not saying we should strive to mimic or mirror Pennsylvania's tax rates. I'm merely just providing some comparison. They're 74.1 cents a gallon on diesel in Pennsylvania, and yeah, and we are 23.7 if you're a heavy truck. So
the average, if you include Pennsylvania, and I always say it's a bit of an outlier, was 52 cents.
Include Virginia in the average?
But However, when you went back and you looked at New York,
So there's some other interesting things other states do. So some states do this all just through fuel tax rates. What we found is that Oregon, New York, New Mexico, and Kentucky have this unique construct called it's like a highway use tax or a heavy truck surcharge, and it's a per mile fee that is charged on vehicles over a certain weight threshold. In some states, it's over 18,000, and others it's over 60,000, and in some it's over 26,000. But in New York, if you are a tractor trailer, 80,000 pounds, you pay an extra 5.46 cents per mile in New York to travel on those roadways, excluding the throughway, which is their toll road kind of system there. And I'm assuming the rate is just collected through a toll in that event. But the average truck at that size gets around 6 miles to the gallon. So if you're putting that in perspective, they have a 30-cent per gallon kind of extra surcharge that's not collected at the pump, that's collected in those states for heavy vehicles. Oregon, and again, I'm not saying that we should strive to mimic Oregon's fee structure. They don't have a diesel tax, but they have this surcharge. I forget the name of it. The name's actually immaterial. You pay 20.48 cents per mile if you are an 80,000-pound truck driving on the roadways in Oregon. At an effective diesel tax rate, that's $1.22 a gallon. Again, I think that's a bit stiff. I think that would put Virginia in some potentially uncompetitive circumstances. So, I don't think anyone is implying or seeking to imply that we should mirror the rates in those states. What I want to just drive across is, as we've dug into this situation, we believe there's some equity issues that need to be considered as we look at both potentially the 81 corridor, but also generally sustainable funding sources for the Commonwealth long term. In addition to having lower rates on our fuels tax and registration fees, we also have a retail sales and use tax. And so we have just residents paying a much greater amount into the system than they do in other states. I'm not here to say that's good or bad. I'm just saying with regard to the equity and how we fund our transportation system compared to other states, we have residents paying a much higher share.
Up to that. So what's the other side of that equation? Obviously, our system has evolved this way for a reason. What does the Commonwealth think that they benefit, or how do we think we benefit because of these lower rates? And has there been any thinking done about, well, what would happen if by chance the legislature decided to reallocate that share so that the truckers pay a higher cost? Would it at all adversely impact industry, or what have? I mean, what do we think?
Madam Chair, Mr. Brown, so the way taxes are collected on trucks is a unique construct. It's very different, even though it's the same tax structure for cars. Truckers remit diesel tax payments on a quarterly basis through an international system called the International Fuels Tax Agreement. So they have tanks that can be upwards of several hundred gallons of fuel, and so you could fill up in Tennessee and drive all the way through Virginia and never stop to buy diesel fuel. However, that doesn't mean they're not paying. I want to really stress that. We've had a lot of discussions with the truckers here, and some people have misconceptions about that. They then track their miles driven in a given state, and every quarter they kind of say, I get 6 miles to the gallon, I drove this many miles. That means in Virginia, I effectively use this many gallons of diesel fuel. Here's a check to remit that kind of back to you. I make that point because if you're driving along the 81 corridor, they're effectively paying 23 divided by 6 in Virginia per mile. They're paying 74 divided by 6 in Pennsylvania. Maryland and West Virginia are both in the upper 30s. I think they're both around 36 or 37 cents per gallon. And again, the trucks they're making these trips. Many of the trucks on 81, based on studies that DRPT and VDOT did, particularly back in the late 2008, 2009 timeframe, around 60% of the trucks on 81 aren't making deliveries. They're starting somewhere outside of Virginia and they're going somewhere else further outside of Virginia. So again, I think there's ways where the rate could be increased without creating negative economic impacts. I think the Secretary and I have had a lot of discussions that we think 74 cents is probably a lot higher than a kind of comfortable zone there. But these trucks are delivering goods between two places, and they're paying these much higher rates in other states. They're just not paying that rate here.
Mr. Donohue's heard me say many times that we want our trucking industry and our manufacturers to be competitive. There's no doubt. you know, as we've been going through this process, making sure that we are at or below the average along the 81 corridor. We want to be able to be there, even taking into account, you know, the outliers. So anyway, we're very committed to trying to keep this a very competitive process. I'm sorry, Mr. Casper.
Should Nick answer?
Okay. Mr. Miller?
As we talk about this, one of the most compelling statistics that I've heard about serving on this board, and and it's been reaffirmed a number of times, I know it's not exact, but the impact of a fully loaded tractor trailer on pavement is 10,000 cars. 10,000. Not 1,000, not 500, 10,000 cars. So when we talk about maintenance and good repair and concrete and asphalt and whatever, one truck is 10,000 cars. So that sort of plays into the equity as well. And I'm not an advocate of, you know, killing any sector of the economy, but, you know,
And
that's a lot. You know, that's a lot of difference.
And Madam Chair, Mr. Miller, just in fairness to the trucking industry and the association, I feel that I need to note they take extreme exception to that figure. I have no clue what the veracity of that figure. I know it is in studies and reports. Just to speak for the trucking association, since I have the mic and they don't, and they may be watching or not for all I know, but I'm sure they'll hear about this discussion. They take extreme exception to that. I think the broader point, though, that you are making generally is trucks are 6% of our VMT. Trucks take up the space, as much space as 2 cars on flat land, 4 to 5 cars on the hilly terrain on 81. And even if their impact is only 5 or 6 times that of a car, and every study I've seen, it says it's much greater than 5 or 6 times, an equitable share of funding our transportation system would be around 30%. And that's just assuming their impact is 5 or 6 times. Again, ASCHO, I think, says 300 or 400 empty. I think the figure is kind of immaterial, honestly, because even at very, very low numbers, the share should be something in excess of 16%.
And you have been very good, though, about making that clear, that lowering that impact.
And this is just something that I think we need to have discussions with at this body as we complete this study, kind of moving forward, understanding who's paying for our system, who's benefiting from it. Again, ideally, we do have transportation funding streams where there's some relationship to who's paying and who's benefiting and other things of that nature, so that we can have an equitable funding stream for our transportation system in Virginia, both thinking about cars versus trucks, but also in-state versus out-of-state users of our system. You know, one of the other things our reliance on the retail sales and use tax does is it means Virginians pay a lot more of that. You tend to, you know, retail sales, it's, again, only a few pennies on the dollar, but when you make your large purchases or most of your purchases, it's near your house. And so, again, people traveling through may stop at Wendy's and get a spicy chicken sandwich, but 5.3 cents on the spicy chicken combo is, I think, only 20 or 30 cents. And so we'll take the 20 or 30 cents, but, you know, I just bought a computer last year, and the computer was over $1,000. And that's a lot more money coming in. And so in retail sales in general, it's just something that's more on the burden of residents in the state. And, again, I think that's something that this board should talk about as we consider how we finance our transportation system and look at sustainable funding sources moving forward. Again, the flip side of that is the sales taxes are our single growing revenue streams, and if everything else grew like those, you guys would have $2 billion more to allocate this June that you don't have today. So moving forward, we do have a team on board working on this issue, and this is a collaborative process involving both VDOT, DRPT, and we have a consultant team on board. One of the first things we're really going to try and work to do is we think we've hit this inflection point where driving is going to go up and fuels tax collections will either stay flat, go down, or in the best case scenario, grow mildly moving forward. We want to try and really understand what do we think the trends are going to be, what is the market penetration of these more fuel efficient vehicles, so that we can in a much more accurate manner quantify the impacts to our revenue streams to kind of provide that to the General Assembly. I think they need to understand we know something very bad is going to happen to transportation revenues in the future. I think people are trying to say, well, is that in 2 years? Is that in 10 years? Kind of when is that? And I think it's incumbent upon this body and us working with you to provide that information and do the homework so the General Assembly can have that as they consider whether this is an issue they wish to address. Once we have that information, we're going to start also looking at other states. How are they financing their system? Who's paying in-state versus out-of-state, cars versus trucks, and other things of that nature? Have anyone found ways to make these revenue streams in Virginia that are not sustainable or are not growing with inflation grow better? Not grow better, that's a great way of saying that. Grow in a more sustainable manner. We have some, sorry. We do know some other states, for example, I think Georgia and both Maryland index their fuels tax rates for inflation. So they're growing at 2+%. And again, if we had done that in Virginia in 2011, we'd be in a much better place than we are today. But there may be other things as well. We do know there are some pilot programs going on with vehicle miles traveled. That may be a bit too far for what we're doing here, but we do think it's still probably something that needs to be investigated, examined, and looking at so that we can understand how a system like that might work. And then ultimately, you know, provide some options to the General Assembly for their consideration about both mid and long-term solutions to this problem so that we can really create a sustainable transportation system that will be here in 10 or 15 years and be able to deliver, you know, enhancements to this system and take care of what we have. So with that, Madam Chair, I'd be happy to answer any questions the board may have.
Madam Secretary, Nick, when do you expect to have this completed, or are we, you know, what's the timeline here?
Madam Chair, Ms. Hines, we are directed by the Assembly to report back to them after your December board meeting. So this is something that would need to be completed in the interim. At April, I can probably give you some better sense of steps in between now and then. We're just kind of getting this running now that the Assembly has gone home for their regular session, and so we can kind of come up for air from that experience and start to map out a kind of a work plan to get from here to December.
I appreciate that. You know, there was a tremendous amount of conversation in Northern Virginia before this last session about the impacts that people are feeling from the Metro funding decision and the impacts on both the localities and MVTA. And so somebody asked earlier, like, you know, can we roll this all into one thing? And I'm sure people are going to be interested in how this might or might not affect those issues because they're proving to be quite constraining.
Anything else?
Secretary?
Mr. Johnson.
The 81 study that was originally done, and then with a round number of $4 billion to be looked at, then moved down to a point, I believe it was 1.2 billion, or 1.2 billion, okay, to do roughly 75% of what the original study looked at. Are we now looking at focusing on the second aspect of that study, i.e. the $2 billion, or are we wide open to take a hard look at the $4 billion initial look, if you will, to overall do all the work that's necessary to get it to the best condition we think we can get it to?
Madam Chair, Mr. Johnson, I would say during session, one of the things we heard from many legislators is we should do all four. We shouldn't just be focusing on the two. I would say that I think we should be focusing on what can get 51 and 21 in the House and Senate at any given moment in time. And if that amount does all $4 billion, that would be amazing and great and wonderful outcome. If it does $1 billion, then we'll have continued discussions with them in future sessions about how to get from 1 to 2. If it does 2, I suspect there will be discussions in future sessions about how to get from 2 to 4 and other things of that nature. I would stress that this study, though, that I'm talking about here is broader and statewide in nature. I think the 81 discussions have, there are those who are trying to get something done, there are those who are trying to get more than $2 billion done, and there are those who are focused on $2 billion, and unfortunately there's probably a few who are not focused on any of those options there. So I think it's an ongoing discussion with the Assembly about what the target is that they're looking to solve. Again, I think from our perspective, a $2 billion figure was something that could be handled well by the contracting community along that corridor. We knew there would be a high cost benefit from that because we were focused on those top problem areas, but in fairness to many legislators, they said they didn't think $2 billion was enough when we identified $4 billion for just the top 20% of problem areas.
Madam Chair.
We'll just,
One follow-up, if I may. What's the current status of the concern about moving the weight of 80,000 pounds to 95,000 pounds?
Madam Chair, Mr. Johnson, there was some discussion in the 2018 session regarding whether VDOT would choose to voluntarily participate in a federal program if the federal government established a pilot program. And I know that sounded a little odd, but that's actually what the word said. That would allow vehicles that weighed more than 80,000 pounds to use the interstate highways. Ms. McGee, I think, presented to you all in December that without knowing the parameters of that federal program, it is hard for us to quantify what the impacts might be on our roadways. And at this time, the federal government, there are no pending legislative vehicles that are moving that would create that in either house. That was an issue that was discussed in the appropriations bills in 2016 and 2017. I'm not sure if the members who were there and pushing those issues are still present or in the same positions on the Appropriations Committee. So I think we're going to continue to monitor what's happening at the federal level, but ultimately Virginia cannot unilaterally make that decision. It would have to be an act of Congress that would create a pilot program or some other thing that then Virginia could determine whether or not it wished to participate in.
Thank you.
Mr. Donahue, did something come out? I think there was a bill that came out of this session.
There's some legislation. I think there were some members of the Assembly who were concerned that we said we didn't have enough information to quantify what the impacts of participating in a pilot program of that nature could be, and so they then passed a bill telling us to collect data on truck impacts on the roadway and I believe truck safety issues there. Ultimately, I'm not sure that's going to provide us with the information we need to know whether participating in a yet to be defined federal pilot program is beneficial or not for the Commonwealth. I think many of the nuances and specifics of whether that would be beneficial to the Commonwealth aren't dependent just on the trucks. It's dependent on how the federal pilot program is structured there. And so until the federal government kind of tells us, here's the program and here are the rules, it's always, in my personal opinion, going to be very difficult for us as staff working these agencies to say it's a good idea or a bad idea because we don't actually know what they're talking about yet because it's just kind of a concept.
Chair?
Ms. White, that's on your list, right? Yes, okay. Mr. Williams.
I would, given the reality check that Nick shared with us about the 51 and 21, probably not going to be able to do much of this work till after November 5th, which is Election Day. Because if there's as many switches and changes as happen in so many retirements, it's really going to be hard to predict what would get 51 and 21 until after you see the results of that day. Because it will impact greatly what we should send to them in terms of recommendations.
Mr. Smoot.
Madam Chair, my understanding is that one of the functions, one of the responsibilities of this body is to provide advice with regard to having an efficient transportation system in the Commonwealth that contributes to the quality of life, to our economic well-being. It seems to me clear from the numbers that we've been given that we're not meeting that challenge in calling sufficient public attention to the funding dilemma, which is just going to get worse in the lack of some other action. So I hope we will take advantage of this opportunity later in the year to lift this issue up and to help promote a sense of reality as to what is happening to our ability to maintain quality transportation in the Commonwealth. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Smoot. We'll say that we spend a great deal of our time trying to make that point. I think what's been very encouraging for us is that as a public issue and as an issue within the General Assembly, it is definitely garnering more interest and support. So, okay, with that, I think we will adjourn our workshop and, no, right? Yes. Yeah. I'm sorry. I saw your expression. I'm like, oh, did you have something else? No. Okay, we will adjourn the workshop and move into our action meeting. So with that, we invite the public to come and address the board. The limit is 3 minutes. Is anybody signed up? Nobody has signed up. No one has signed up, but we certainly invite public comment should anybody want to speak with us. Okay. Okay, thank you. It must have gone really well yesterday, so I will take that as a positive sign. Do I have a motion on the minutes?
Second.
All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Those opposed, nay. Thank you. Mr. Hofrichter. Good morning.
Good morning, Secretary Valentine, members of the board. I bring before you a request for the abandonment of an institutional road. It's Route 357 in Dinwiddie County. This highway served the Southside Virginia Training Center and a parole facility. Those have since moved. The property has been sold, and this roadway no longer serves any state institutions.
Moved.
Any questions? Oh, excuse me, do I have a motion?
Moved.
Any further discussion? All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Thank you.
Mr. Walton.
You wanted to see Julie Brown here today, but I gave her the day off, so. Anyway,
Very few meetings without Ms. Brown.
it's true. I think Mr. Donahue's taken over for being at every meeting other than Ms. Brown. The next item is a reallocation of revenue sharing funds to a project in Dickinson County. It's the balance of a revenue sharing project that is completed, and it will help the projects being transferred to meet an advertisement schedule, and we would ask for your approval.
Madam Chair, I'd move that reallocation.
Second.
Any further discussion? All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Thank you, Mr. Walton. We'll tell Ms. Brown you did a great job. Mr. Moore, good morning.
Morning, Madam Chairman and members of the board. We have a limited access control change for a project located in Richmond District. This is at I-95 and Route 10 interchange improvements. They consist of widening the westbound Route 10 to I-95 northbound on-ramp from 1 lane to 2 lanes, conversion of the I-95 northbound to eastbound Route 10 off-ramp from stop control to free flow, and some additional widening of the eastbound lanes from 2 to 4 between the ramp terminal and intersection with Old Stage Road. It's located in Chesterfield County. It was the modification is along I-95. It was, public hearings been held. Project was endorsed by the Chesterfield County Board of Supervisors at their July 27, 2016 meeting, and it was approved by FHWA in February of 2019. I recommend that this change be made to advance the project.
Moved.
Any further discussion? All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Ms. Pryor. Good morning.
Morning. I have 2 items for your consideration today. The first is the amendment of 3 projects to the 6-year improvement program. They are all funded with local funds or funded through an MPO, and I recommend your approval.
Secretary, I move.
Any further discussion? All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Those opposed?
Second item is my normal monthly transfers, and I recommend your approval.
Any further discussion? All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Those opposed?
Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Pryor. Mr. Brule.
Good morning, Madam Secretary, members of the board. I have 2 action items for you today. The first is action on the policy for the implementation of performance-based statewide transit operating allocations. This is the 3rd and final element of last year's transit reform package to come to you for action on the policy. We briefed you back in December and again in January with the draft policy. At that point in time, the draft policy was still out for public comment, and there was legislation that was pending. So there are a couple of changes that have been made to the draft, the resolution that was presented as a draft in January. First, we did address one of the public comments that we received by adding some language about the use of any increased funds to transit agencies. If they saw an increase in their allocation, that we encourage them to put that towards service enhancements and expansion rather than reducing a local share. And second, the legislation that came out of the General Assembly this year enabled us just for fiscal year 20 to provide up to $3 million out of our transit operating reserve to offset any negative impacts that come with the implementation of the new formula. That's also been added to the policy. We did receive about 10 public comment letters. We took that information into consideration. We made some technical changes to guidance that's going to be promulgated by the department. The most significant elements of that feedback were around some definitions related to commuter service, and those have been addressed. So with that, we recommend your approval of the policy that's before you today.
Secretary, I move.
Second.
Any further discussion? Represents a tremendous amount of work, I will say. All those in favor?
Aye.
Opposed, nay. Thank you.
Thank you. Second item I have for you today is the item that we briefed you on yesterday related to the WMATA Platform Improvement Program of projects that are planned for summer of 2019. The action before you would add a project to our 6-year improvement program that would allocate $3.6 million to mitigation efforts that are outlined in our Virginia Supplemental Mitigation Plan. This would allow us to work with those impacted localities to make mid-cycle grants to allow that work to proceed and for them to be prepared for the shutdown that begins in May.
I move approval.
Second.
Further discussion? All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Those opposed, nay. Thank you. I would say, Director Mitchell, there are a lot of reforms when it's come to transit this past year. The capital prioritization plan, the reform we just passed on operating, and the strategic plans are moving forward. So a tremendous amount of work. So thank you. Mr. Moore, you're back.
Morning again, Madam Chairman and members of the board. I have two items, both bridge namings. The first is from Tazewell County Board of Supervisors, Bristol District. This is a commemorative naming of the bridge on State Route 102, Bosaven Road, over Laurel Fork, Tazewell County, as the Thomas Burns Childress Memorial Bridge. The Tazewell County Board of Supervisors would like to memorialize the life and contributions of Thomas Burns Childress to his community. Mr. Childress worked in many roles to preserve and protest the town of Pocahontas. He served on multiple committees and was a veteran of the United States Army, serving as a medical clerk from 1969 to 1971. Mr. Childress fell from the old bridge and broke his back. After the accident, he brought attention to the condition of the bridge and became the driving force for replacing the bridge until his passing on December 17, 2016. VDOT supports this request.
Madam Chair, had the honor of working with Mr. Childress. He was a member of our faculty at the college, and I know him personally. And it's my honor and privilege to make this motion.
Thank you. All those in favor, please stand.
Aye.
Thank you.
Second request is from the Prince William County Board of Supervisors, Nova District. It's the commemorative naming of the bridge on Route 622, Groveton Road, over Interstate 66, Prince William County, as the Watering Memorial Bridge. The Prince William County Board of Supervisors wants to honor the lives and contributions of Raymond and Pauline Watering, who were longtime residents of Prince William County. Mr. and Mrs. Watering led the fight over many years to preserve the Manassas National Battlefield Park, and then ultimately donated their property to the Civil War Preservation Trust. VDOT supports this request.
Secretary, I move.
Second.
All those in favor, please stand. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Moore. Commissioner.
Morning.
Good morning.
Chairman, members of the board, I have two items before you. I'm going to let the last item to Deputy Secretary Nick Donahue to present. The first item that I have is the endorsement of the Commissioner's certification to the Governor and the General Assembly for the 64 Hampton Roads Bridge Tunnel Expansion Project under the Public-Private Partnership Act. As I briefed the board yesterday, this has been a procurement that has been underway since December 2017. We started with the P3 steering committee in December. The commissioner, at the time, Commissioner Kirkpatrick, issued a finding of public interest in January of 2018. In March of 2018, we received statements of qualifications from 3 firms. Later that month, or in May 2018, I reaffirmed to the P3 steering committee that the original finding of public interest was continue to be in force. Later that month, we received proposals or issued the draft RFP. Throughout the calendar year, summer and fall, and leading into winter, we had a number of proprietary meetings with the proposers. And in January, received technical proposals. February of 2019, we received the cost proposals. And then in March, we have gone through we've identified the apparent best value firm to be able to lead the design build effort. We've taken that proposal, gone through the independent P3 or independent audit of that, and we're here today to reaffirm that finding of public interest. So today we're recommending or seeking the CTB's endorsement of the certification of the governor and the members of the General Assembly, which will be indicating support of the execution of the comprehensive agreement with the successful design bidder. We are making the recommendation for the endorsement of the board.
Make a motion we approve.
Second.
Further discussion? All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Those opposed? Thank you, Mr. Commissioner.
Next item that I have before you is the authorization for the Commissioner of Highways to enter into the project agreement for funding and administration with the Hampton Roads Transportation Accountability Commission relating to the I-64 Hampton Roads Bridge Tunnel Expansion Project. As I briefed the board yesterday, VDOT and HR TAC have been working collaboratively over the last several months to develop a project funding agreement. Those broad commercial terms were presented to the Commonwealth Transportation Board on February 8th as a term sheet. Yesterday, I presented to the board the refined PAFA is what we'll call it. In broader terms, it is a part of your package today, and we are recommending the approval of endorsing that for giving me the broad terms and capability to execute that agreement.
Madam Secretary, I move approval.
Any further discussion? All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Thank you.
Madam Secretary, members of the board, I have Resolution 12 before you. This deals with the resolution that would put in place a funding and financing plan for the replacement of the southern trestles as a part of the Hampton Roads Bridge Tunnel project. You were briefed on this yesterday. What this resolution will do is provide a one-time authorization to increase the cap for the Hampton Roads District to allow for an additional funding, which is anticipated to be a little over $20 million to be provided in FY25 and FY26 from other districts to help complete the funding package for that improvement there. I would note that based on the feedback we received yesterday from Mr. Whitworth, there are new provisions included in this document, which I believe have been, we've pushed that out to you all there, and so that's at the end of the be it resolved there that says that the amount that we increase the cap by shall be limited exclusively to that which is necessary to pay for this work. So ultimately, in FY26, if the contingency or other things end up not being needed, we would waive the cap at a lower amount, which would then leave that money back in the other districts. So we won't even take the money if it's not necessary, to ensure that should this come in under, which we always hope is the outcome, those funds will be available for application in the other districts.
Approval?
I don't
Or
know.
second?
Second. Any further discussion? I will just say, I would like to thank Mr. Whitworth, Ms. Hines, and a number of you yesterday. You really looked at this from a statewide perspective, and so I thank you very much for this. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Those opposed? Thank you. Mr. Caples, good morning.
Morning, Madam Secretary, members of the board. I have 9 projects before you today for your consideration. The first project is order number 136. This was a Bristol District plant mix contract in Wise County. We had 2 offers on this project. After conducting an analysis of the bids received, we have found that the bid represents good value as well as market value, and we're recommending for your approval.
Madam Chair, I move approval.
Second.
Any further discussion? All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Next project is order number 978. This is a Northern Virginia District plant mix contract in Loudoun County. We had 4 offers on this project. Again, after conducting an analysis of the bid submitted, we find that it represents both market value and a good value for the Commonwealth, and recommend for your approval.
Secretary, I move.
Second.
Any further discussion? All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Next project is order number 979. This is another Northern Virginia District plant mix contract in Prince William County. We had 6 offers on this project. Again, after conducting our bid analysis, we find that it both represents a good value as well as market value, and are recommending award.
Any further discussion? All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Thank you.
Next project is UPC 106573. This is a design build contract for Route 7 and Battlefield Parkway interchange in the town of Leesburg in Northern Virginia District. We had 3 offers on this project. This project did, after conducting a bid analysis, it did come in within the range of the evaluative estimate. However, due to a funding shortfall, our initial recommendation was to reject the job. After consultation with the town of Leesburg and understanding the importance of this job for them, they were able to secure other funds and want to move forward with the project. So I'm here before you today to recommend award of this project.
A lot of time talking with district staff, understanding the puts and takes here. This is a very important project, and so I would recommend that move approval of this project.
Madam Secretary, I agree with that. It just, when we missed it by over 30%, it raises a level of concern.
Mr. Yates.
Question, just want to know what happened.
There's another one on here later that's a similar miss, and there's others that we're starting to see across the state. And we're meeting with industry in a video conference on the 29th of March to see if this is a change in market condition or something else. But it's not every project, but many of ours are rising some. But we've seen both in the design build and the design bid build. So it's not just one method of delivery. It's across right now, and there are some things we haven't brought to you yet. We're seeing it across multiple districts in different parts of the state. So it's something we're going to go back and evaluate, but we may be seeing the first of a tightening in the market, and whether that's because our large projects are out. We've been hearing these things for a while, but they're starting to pop up in these. Now, did we do something internally that may have resulted in part of this? Yes, but we're also want to be aware, because our data is based on past history. One of the things that when we're meeting on the 29th is we're going to have the estimators as part of that discussion from some of these companies. We want to kind of see what they're seeing. So we're seeing that. I just want to let you know we're looking at it, and we don't know, because it's not in the first 5 years in this job, I maybe stepped up once and said we blew it on something where we were 25% out, maybe twice. And now we're seeing a cluster of these, so I think it's something we need to pay attention to. Is the market changing? So I just wanted to give visibility that we're paying attention and seeing what we may need to do.
Here, extra money being put in?
Yeah, they're funding it, so we're recommending going forward, but But, and there were a number of bidders, so you've got to say that it's fair value when you get, you know, three bids on it, so.
One comment, though, that to answer a question as to why it's so far off, one thing that we're showing in the estimated construction estimate before you was that scope was added as an addendum to the contract without updating that engineer's estimate. So the evaluative estimate that we have done at the time of the bid showed that we are getting good value. It's not the 30+% off. However, the engineer's estimate was not updated to reflect the addition of the scope at the time of the addition, which is...
I would just, to that, what this particular project has caused the town of Leesburg and the county of Loudoun to do is ask themselves a prioritization question. And so they have to meet the funding gap. They have prioritized this project, which is ready to go, which is important, over some things that had smaller amounts of money in order to finish one. And in some ways, it seems to me that's partly what we're trying to help cities and counties do, is when there's a problem, understand that they partially own this problem, and it's up to them to step into the breach. They certainly did not ask for any more money from this board at all.
Chairman, I'm sort of hearing two different things, and I want to make sure I'm bored in properly. So we're 33% high, but the scope changed a lot. How much of the 33% do we think is scope change, and how much is estimating difference? Because I'm not, you know, if it's 28% scope change, I'm not so exercised about it.
What I'm going to say is that there's about $10 million that is additional scope changed, which will take it there. And frankly, there's $4 million in that estimate that we did not have correctly entered into the estimating at the time of the project. So
well, if you got 10 million of scope change and 4 million of difference, that's a lot different. Okay, so 4 million of difference is 10%. So we're off by 10, not 33.
That's correct.
You know, not to jump on you, Mr. Moore, but when you present that to us, it's a different picture to me if you say it's not 33%, it's really 10% plus scope change as opposed to just letting us hang on 33.
But to Mr. Moore's point is that we're seeing the inflection point, and we'll show you with the next bid.
That is rude.
He's mourning.
Wake up. He's rude.
We're seeing that inflection point in a number of our design build projects, and this is one of them where there's risk already built into it. The costs are starting to increase, and we have a saturated marketplace in projects that are over a certain dollar amount, that we're seeing the same design builders competing for the same jobs that are already, 66 is under construction in Northern Virginia that's consuming quite a bit of the resources that we have there today too. So we are there, and you'll see in the next bid that Mr. Caples will be sharing with you, we have another one at a roughly 37% off, and there's some other explanation as to why that is. But in this case, yes, we still have the inflection point. There was scope that was added to the project, and yes, we did miss something, about $4 million worth of work in this bid that should have been in there that was not appropriately adequate. And that's, I think this goes back to the transparency that we want to bring back to you, that both we'll own it when there's an issue there, the $4 million, but certainly this estimate should have been updated to reflect the addition of scope.
Not to sort of belabor it, but I hear what you're saying, but this project does not demonstrate to me that we are at an inflection point, because you said all the money that's been added is because of scope and because of an error in estimating. That's no inflection impact for me. Now, the next one may be, but this one is not.
Madam Secretary, I think it would be appropriate with Mr. Moore's investigation that if he learns something about the dynamics of the industry that are transitioning, that he comes back and informs us what he learns, and something that we should know as a body moving forward if there are indeed these dynamics transitioning in the industry?
We'll come back at the next work session with something and what we think we know and give a breakdown. And I think the same thing, it's fair, a breakdown on this one, what's not included and what's to we think is attributable. And then some of these things, to be honest, I think after talking with them, it may be just what we think we know at that point, and we'll continue to investigate. Okay.
Commissioner, sorry. Oh, all right.
At
Mr.
a
Williams.
minimum for the short term, just get used to this, because it's going to be, because they use history for their estimates. What they don't have in front of them is, I don't have enough people to even do the job. I'm going to have to go out and pay double to get them in here to do it. So they don't have that in front of them. They don't have the luxury of having that. And for the short term, it's going to be like this. I mean, the plant mix design projects seem to have gone down a little bit. That's because their cost of making the plant mix has gone way down because of fuel cost, but their labor has probably kept it from going down as much as it would have. So, we're under it every time on that. So it's hard for them they just can't. They don't have the luxury of what the contractor has in front of them to make these, to bid the job. And it's just going to be like this for a while, until they free up some people to be aggressive.
I don't disagree with you at all. But if those dynamics are here short-term, mid-term, long-term, then they got to be in the estimating process at some point in time.
They'll catch up to it soon.
Commissioner, did you want to?
I have 2 points. The first point, Mr. Malvin, is the engineer's estimate is based upon what we call a transport estimate that is 2 years, over a 2-year history of bid prices and bid tabs, both statewide and specific to the district that it's being, the work's being conducted in. So there is a historical bid tab, but the evaluative estimate is based upon in real time looking at what the construction industry or the contractors, the availability of resources, the material costs at that real time. And that's why, as Mr. Capel said, is that we were very close on the evaluative estimate, albeit that the engineer's estimate that's shown here is lacking. The second point that I'd like to say back to the entire board is that we've asked, noting that we're starting to see bid prices associated with design build contracts exceeding our engineer's estimate as well as in some cases the evaluative estimate, we're now taking a look at whether we need to have more of a shift back to the design bid build environment to allow for additional competition into the marketplace to be able to handle this. And so there is that evaluation that's ongoing to look at whether or not we've saturated the marketplace with design build contracts, and design bid build may be a much more appropriate mechanism to go. Whether there's a price point that is making the determination for the contracting industry go, no-go in this as well to afford some additional competition. So I hope to have that, whether it's the April meeting or the May meeting, we'll bring that back, but those are some of the conversations that we're having internally to be able to see whether or not to encourage additional competition and get these bid prices back in line. Are we seeing something that we're tighter on the design bid build estimates and bring those forward, and there's either a saturated marketplace or we're not accounting for the risk associated with design build. There's some of those questions that we're looking at that we'll bring back to the board either at the April meeting or the May meeting.
Madam Secretary, I don't want to be construed as being critical of this. I know there's a lot of changes going on in this industry, particularly with the amount of work and the economy. But we rely heavily on these estimates, particularly when we're going through a smart scale process. We're allocating based on estimates. And if we have a lot of variability in that, it's going to compromise that process to some extent. And that's my concern. So.
Excellent point. Mr. Whitworth.
Remind me, I guess, of process here. This was a smart scale project, I assume. Is that correct?
I'm going to
Can't
look for
remember.
Kim Pryor.
Well, assuming it was, and it
No, she's saying it is not, no.
well, when scope is increased after authority is granted for the project, what is our process to go back and evaluate, in this case, a scope increase of 25%?
I believe in this case, the scope was requested by the town, and it was inserted into the construction documents at the request of the town.
Had we already approved the lower amount?
We had approved the engineer's estimate to be able to take it to advertisement, and it was fully funded at that point in time.
So when a request for additional scope comes up, does that get deliberated again at this body, or is it simply incorporated in and we go forward?
Be incorporated at the time of the amendment that was put out. It would not be brought back to this body.
Even in a smart scale project?
In this case, the smart scale, if they added that much scope back to the project, it would need to be brought back to the board for consideration.
Why is there a difference between a project that's funded by smart scale versus a project that's not?
Mr. Whitworth, I think you've asked a really good question. And I think maybe we will look at how that process actually unfolds. When was the amendment added?
Last summer.
So in the summer. So there's been quite a time delay in this, but I think that's a really good point, Mr. Caples, Mr. Moore, of looking at when there are changes, amendments to the scope of a project, what is the process within smart scale and beyond smart scale? So I think that would be very good to know as we're looking at this. I will just say to the board that very early on, the commissioner placed a very high focus on looking at the bids and the smart scale process. We've been looking at at-risk projects since Route 7 came up. And we realized that there were some issues, as Mr. Williams has kind of pointed out to us. So we are actually monitoring these bids very closely to make sure that they're falling in line. This one may be beyond it. But as Mr. Dodson brought up yesterday, changes in the markets, changes in prices, changes in competition, in some places actually saturating the market. There are a lot of forces at work right now, and I do believe that the commissioner, Mr. Moore, are placing a high priority of trying to understand what's going on so we can have a more accurate bidding process. I mean, look how hard we worked yesterday in the presentation Mr. Donahue brought forward to try to fund these trestles, where we had to keep looking for how we could close the gaps. So you are right, Mr. Baldwin. You know, these estimates are so important. So anyway, I think that it's a priority, I know, within the department to make sure we have all the information or the best information that we can.
Madam Secretary, I guess I've listened to all the commentary on this, and I'm still not really clear. Is this a lapse in our procedure or something we need to change policy-wise, or was this an error?
Madam Secretary, what I'd say is that this is frankly an egregious error. We should never, at the time that scope was changed, we should have identified where the additional funds were coming from to make that project whole, period.
So our program approach is okay?
Our program approach is spot on. We're going back and having the conversation. We've had the conversation with the district and the staff there to be able to say that if there is scope that is added, the funds need to be identified at that point in time and not hope that the project comes in under bid, or we can add that and absorb that into the bid price. The $4 million that was missed, that was a miss on our part, and frankly, if that was a miss, we own that part.
So we had two factors.
So we had two factors, but frankly, that if we're adding scope to a project, we need to identify where the funds are and make that project whole at the time of the addition. So that is where the system broke down, and we're taking care of that issue.
Thanks for the clarification.
I'll just add, though, this is one issue. There is something else going on. So It's an and. So as you go through you'll see that one could be a mistake or a lapse in a process, and there are some other forces at work as well. All right, all right, so where are we? Do I have a second?
Yep.
Any further discussion? All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
All those in favor, those opposed? Thank you, Mr. Yates.
All right.
Okay.
The next project is another design-build contract. This is the contract for a bridge replacements on I-81 over Route 11 in Smith County in Bristol District. We had 3 bids received on this project. The 3 bids that we did receive, the first and second bidder were within 5% of one another. It is our opinion that the bid actually represents market value. The low bid did exceed the range of the evaluative estimate by about 10% and the designer's estimate by about 27%. These increases are attributable to a couple different things. The first being some quantity discrepancies, really from when we go out with a very limited plan and provide that information to the potential bidders. They further refine that plan and refine the actual individual elements of the plan, and in doing so, some of the quantities were fairly significantly off on this project, and therefore our estimate, both the evaluative estimate and the design estimate, were askew. And I guess to follow up to the Commissioner's point, in order to address these issues moving forward, these inaccuracies, if you will, we're going to establish a team of subject matter experts that we're going to provide independent review and validation of these estimates, the designer's scoping estimates, I should say. And at the time that they prepare the actual cost finance summary sheet, which is actually where we lock in the funding to go to advertisement, and that estimate will be reviewed and updated based on any addendums, any changes during advertisement to kind of capture those changes. Therefore, it's reflected in both the design estimate and then once it gets to me and my staff when we're actually doing the evaluative estimate at the same time the contractors are. And then we'll document any of those discrepancies that we find to kind of do a forensics on it so we understand where we're going. But at this point in time, with 3 bidders, the 2 bidders being within 5% of one another, we are recommending award of this project.
I have a motion.
Chairman, next question.
We'll go to
Okay,
the
I'm sorry.
discussion.
Move approval.
Mr. Miller.
Help me again, I got the same question. So we're off on some units or whatever you want to call it, right? How much of the $7 million or $8 million almost is associated with that versus price, versus cost changes?
$4 million?
For the 9?
Correct.
Or excuse me, 4, yeah.
8, yeah.
For the 8, it's 8, so that's the bogey we're trying to, we got 2 different issues. One is some process issues, but to your point, more importantly, is the price increases that we're seeing, and that's about $5 million on 21, so 25%. Thank you.
Just have one. Where is the additional money coming from in this particular case?
Madam Secretary, this is a State of Good Repair project. It will be coming out of the State of Good Repair program.
Be helpful to add that. Oh, like, is it State of Good Repair? So it's coming out of the Commonwealth's money? Is it coming from localities? I just think another piece of information for us to have on these.
Anything else? All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Those opposed?
Next project is Order A59. This is in Richmond District, Henrico County, corridor patching and paving project. We had 3 offers on this. Again, after conducting our analysis, of the bids submitted, we found that they represent both good value as well as market value, and are recommending award.
Mr. Brown. Any further discussion? All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed?
Madam Chair, I need to abstain. I have a close financial relationship with the contractor.
Would note, even in this bid, the bid amount is higher than the estimate, which I know happens, but
It was within the range of the evaluative estimate.
just goes back to our discussion yesterday afternoon, and although we'll kind of go through our list here, I'm concerned about the projects we're approving in connection with Smart Scale 3, and whether or not we need to think about contingency as we go through every dollar that's being allocated. If in fact this trend continues, at some point we're going to be borrowing from the future. So we just have to, I think at some point we're going to need to have a broader discussion about those risks and how we address those.
Mr. Brown, I will just say that, you know, when going through the round 3 proposals, that VDOT was trying to really be on top of the bids that came in, making sure we were trying to push all the districts to try to provide the most accurate information. In some cases, they felt that the actual bids were too high in some cases, but we were trying to be very strong in getting accurate bids back, because they actually witnessed the scrutiny this board actually put on those projects that came in over. So
Madam Secretary, Mr. Brown, what I did say yesterday was certainly that we have had those discussions where we have taken a second look at the applications as they've been submitted, looked at the high-risk elements such as the right-of-way, the utility costs associated with that. Those items that we presented back in the fall as the leading indicators of where we were seeing issues with round 1 and round 2 projects as they were advancing in the program, and put emphasis back there, and did go back to a number of localities to say that their bid prices or their estimates were low. These are the reasons why they were low. Encouraged them to increase them. For the vast majority of them, they were increased. Others felt to go forward with that in a competitive nature. So we have put that emphasis back on it. I will say that there's still that trying to identify what those costs are going to be in years 5 and 6 of a program are going to be very difficult, but as long as we have the contingency built into it, we don't want to overbake the contingency or overestimate that contingency, but certainly have those risk elements identified appropriately at this early stage.
Mr. Caples. Oh, we did that? We did. Yes.
Next project is order number 135. This is a Bristol District plant mix contract in Lee and Scott County. We had 2 offers on this project. After conducting analysis of the bids submitted, we have found that they represent both good value as well as market value, and this project did come in under the evaluative estimate, and we recommend for your approval.
Further discussion? All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Thank you.
This project is order number 139, another Bristol District plant mix contract in Bland, Grayson, and Wythe County. We had 2 offers on this project. After conducting our analysis, we find that it both represents market value as well as a good value. The bid was within the range of the evaluative estimate again, and we are recommending for your approval.
Recommend.
Further discussion? All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Next project is order number A64. This is a Richmond District asphalt resurfacing contract in Chesterfield and Amelia counties. We had 4 offers on this project, and after conducting our analysis, we find that it represents both good value as well as market value. And again, this one came in below the engineer's estimate.
Mr. Brown. Any further discussion? All those in favor say aye.
Aye. Aye.
I've been busy over in Richmond and Bristol.
Next project is order number N96. This is a Salem District contract for the replacement of a bridge over Goose Creek in Bedford County. We had 5 offers on this project. Again, after conducting our bid analysis, find that it represents both market value as well as a good value to the Commonwealth. This project did slightly exceed the range of the evaluative estimate, but we are recommending for your award.
Madam Chair, I recommend approval.
Is there an error? Is there an error here? It says recommended for award 26 million.
At the bottom.
A combination of the project?
It's all the total?
Yes.
Okay.
Didn't exceed, it's 400,000, I mean, mine says the estimated construction 7.7 and the bid amount was 7.4.
About 400,000 below. That's what Ken King, I believe, shared with me too.
Is that what you have, Mr. Caples?
We're getting back to, this is what you're seeing, to kind of go back to the January meeting when we kind of briefed about exactly what we do. This is the design estimate. So this is the estimate that's based on the 2-year history. The evaluative estimate is a confidential estimate that we don't share publicly. So when we did our evaluative estimate, we tightened this up because we saw the competition. We were expecting a little better prices, so it slightly exceeded our estimate, but was well within the range of the design estimate.
Okay, so do we have a second?
Move approval.
Any further discussion? All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed?
And the last project for today is order number A65. This is a Richmond District asphalt resurfacing contract in Nottoway, Dinwiddie, and Prince George County. We had 4 bidders on this project. After conducting our analysis, we find that it represents both market value as well as good value. We are recommending for your award.
Moved.
Any further discussion? All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Madam Chair, for the reasons stated previously, I would abstain on this particular.
Thank you, Mr. Caples. New business? Does anyone have new business before the board? Mr. Lawson, I'm going to have under new business just 2 items. And this is for your awareness.
Correct. Secretary, members of the board. Before you, you have a copy of a letter that was provided from the Secretary. What the letter is notifying you of is a refunding opportunity. As you recall, we carry a standing shelf resolution, as we call it, to do refundings that you approved. And I think the one that we're currently operating under was approved last June. An opportunity that we've been watching came to fruition for a refunding of a series of the Northern Virginia Transportation District bonds, and we are moving forward with such refunding. As you see noted in the letter, the refunding opportunity is about $49 million in bonds that will yield about an 8% present value savings of about $4 million over the term. So this is just again for your awareness. We met with Treasury Board yesterday, and they've approved the transaction, and we will move forward to complete the transaction now.
Questions? Thank you, Mr. Lawson. Yesterday, well, this has been obviously a big meeting. I'm really happy that we're over here on Hampton Roads. We have the certification of public interest for the Hampton Roads Bridge Tunnel. You all have authorized the project agreement for funding and administration, which has represented a tremendous amount of work in collaboration with HR TAC. We passed from the board the funding for the southern trestles, which Mr. Mulvin, Mr. Miller, Mr. Johnson will let you know was an important piece of this and was the right time. I remember Jim Utterback in a meeting said that in order to actually replace these trestles, we had to have this project. There was nowhere to cross the channel, so this was really important, and the timing's important, so I thank you for that. As we've been going through this, we've also been working on a term sheet for the master tolling agreement with Hampton Roads, HR TAC, very much as we have with our publicly owned express lanes on 66 and 395. We have an MOA This term sheet is going to cover all of the covered facilities within the operational network. It goes from Jefferson Avenue down to Bowers Hill. Is it Bowers Hill? I thought, sometimes I go, Bottoms Bridge. No, that's Richmond, but Bowers Hill, the Hampton Roads Bridge Tunnel, and the high-rise bridge. So the operational analysis is currently underway. The results of that are going to be out, or forecasted to be out in late April. That'll allow us, working with HR TAC, to actually see what the tolling options would be, what the revenue estimates, what the projections would provide, and how the network would actually work. We have HOV lanes, hot lanes, reversible lanes, general purpose lanes. This is a challenging network, and our whole purpose is to try to create the greatest throughput that we can for the lowest possible cost. So we have been working on this term sheet with HR TAC. You will be receiving a briefing on the term sheet at the next meeting. I have reached out to the chairman of HR TAC, hoping that Mr. Hipple could come join us at our next meeting, or perhaps the April or May meeting, to address the board, to discuss the work that we've all been doing, how important the PAFA and the PAFA, the Funding and Administration Agreement, as well as this MTA is. So you'll be getting that briefing next month. I did want you to know that that's coming up on the horizon, and is an important component of getting this very important, the largest project in Virginia's history, underway. Just kind of laying that out for you. So any questions or thoughts? I thank you again for having us to your home. Chris Hall, I don't know if he's still here, but I did want to say thank you for having us over in your district. Thank you all for coming, and we stand adjourned.
Well done.